Jennifer,
Hello, Peter.
how are you, Jennifer?
I am well, sir. I hope you are too.
Thank you so much for joining us here on Why We Do What We Do, the Marsys Law created interview series where we spotlight really the leaders in the victims' rights movement and give them an opportunity to tell everybody in the victims' rights movement and people who join in exactly what it was that inspired them to get involved in the victims' rights movement from the beginning. Everybody, it seems, that we've run into has their own personal story. And as we know, when we deal with crime and statistics, that behind every statistic there is a story. It all started for us with Dr. Nicholas's story when his sister in 1983, a University of California Santa Barbara student, was murdered and after being stalked by her ex-boyfriend. And it was after that, after a visit to her grave, that Marcy's mom and Marcy's brother Henry were confronted in a supermarket by the murderer of Marsy, and they had no idea that their sister and daughter's murderer had been released on bail. And at that point, Dr. Nicholas had made it his lifelong mission to make sure that victims were able to be afforded rights and meaningful and enforceable rights in state constitutions and ultimately the United States Constitution. And that's what really brings us together today is your involvement in Marsys Law. And we met several years ago. So thanks for joining us and thanks for sharing your story, which is a very, very difficult story, which turned into a lifelong journey for you.
I'm so grateful for Marsys Law. I'm so grateful for Dr. Nicholas. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share stories. I think sharing stories is so meaningful. And it's been an especial privilege to get to work with you, Peter. You and I have had many amazing intersections in our lives, and I'm honored by the work that you have done for victims all your career.
I appreciate it. I'm honored to be a senior advisor at Marsys Law, and I'm former homicide prosecutor in the city of Boston, where I worked in the DA's office for 13 years. And so your story begins over 30 years ago, and it was April 7th. I'm going to bring you right to that night, April 7th of 1990. And you were a Catholic high school teacher in Chicago at the time, in Illinois, and you had taken your religion class on a weekend retreat. It was a Saturday night. And that Sunday, when you returned home from the retreat, you got a phone call that you'll obviously never forget, and it changed the course of the rest of your life. Who was it that was on the phone, and what did you hear?
Right, it was my mother and father. I had just returned from being away on retreat, so they couldn't reach me any earlier. But earlier that morning, they had gone over to the townhouse that they owned, and that my sister and her husband, my sister Nancy and her husband Richard, and they were pregnant, expecting their first child, living in this townhouse of my parents, waiting to move into their new home. And they hadn't shown up for a family gathering. My father had gone over to look for why they were not there, and saw both of the cars, got worried that they weren't answering the phone, went into the townhouse, and they had called me later in to tell me what they had found, which is they called me that evening when I got home to tell me that they had found Nancy and Richard murdered in the basement of the townhouse. And they had, no idea. I mean, they were just staggering with me on the phone. They're dead. They've been killed. We don't know anything. And they've called the police and just get up here as fast as you can.
And your sister, Nancy, was 25 years old at the time?
Yes, she was 25 and Richard was 29, and they'd been married about 3 years. And then she was, transitioning into her second trimester of pregnancy. And it was a very happy time in their lives. They were such wonderful people.
And at some point, you actually found out once your sister's murderer was caught, you found out what had actually transpired in that house. And it was a 16-year-old high school student who was the murderer, and he had been waiting for them.
Yeah, so it was a neighbor who his parents were known to my parents, but we didn't know this young man. He was almost 17, 4 weeks shy of his 17th birthday. He was a junior at New Trier High School. We found out later, this was 6 months after and just to say, first of all, that 6 months of not knowing who did this and why was absolute hell. But they finally called us in October of that year and said, we have the killer. We've found who did it. And it was this teenager and whose parents were known to us, which was shocking. But what he was motivated by apparently was he was just this later diagnosed sociopath, thrill killer, obsessed with committing the perfect crime. He liked Leopold and Loeb. He liked Manson. He collected information about serial killers. He was fascinated by guns. He wanted to see what it would feel like to kill somebody. And we don't know why he picked Nancy. Probably Nancy and Richard's townhouse was directly in line of sight across the street from the Winnetka, Illinois police station. And he dressed himself all in black on a Saturday night. He had stolen a gun and a .357 Magnum, and he dressed himself up like this assassin in a black trench coat and black gloves and black knit hat and black leather boots and black gloves. And he walked through the Winnetka police station grounds as if to say, look what I can do under your nose and get away with it, on a Saturday night, April 7th, 1990 at 10:30, crossed across the street, walked into the back gate of the end townhouse unit, which was Nancy and Richard's, used a glass cutter to break in through the sliding glass doors in the back. And when he came in and sat down in their living room, he waited for them to return home from a family birthday dinner for my dad. They walked in shortly thereafter, and he held them at gunpoint and ultimately marched them down into the basement, where he shot Richard execution style in the back of the head and turned the gun on Nancy.
And Nancy was pregnant, as you said, and did you later find out how Nancy and her unborn child were both killed?
Yeah, this is the hardest part of all. When I think about how she had to watch Richard's head literally explode in front of her. He shot .357 Magnum point blank in the back of the head with a disruptor bullets, literally exploded his head right in front of her, and he collapsed dead in front of her. And Nancy, had told him she was pregnant, had begged for the life of her child. She actually crossed her arms over her pregnant belly and begged, please don't kill me. Please don't kill my baby. And the killer pointed the gun directly at her pregnant abdomen and fired.
And all of that came out through evidence and autopsy reports and otherwise. And then did she try at some point to make it out of that room and up the stairs, and was she shot again?
Yes. And so what we know from the autopsy is that because we had actually asked them to try to find out the gender of her child, because we knew the boy and girl names that had been picked out. This was before DNA, and we had asked them, but they found out when they went in at the autopsy that the fetus was actually exploded by these disruptor bullets. And so they could not, because it was before DNA, they couldn't tell the gender of the child. So we just had to bury the baby as baby Langert. But she lived, the autopsy revealed that she had maybe lived for up to about 10 minutes after she was shot. And she had turned and tried to get up the stairs, and he shot her in the back of her arm, and then he fled. She fell back down to the basement stairs, and she actually dragged herself over by her elbows next to her husband. But the part that just absolutely has been life-changing for me is that what we know is that as she lay dying, she took her hand in her own blood and she drew a heart and a U. And that's actually how we found her dying, that she had died leaving us this message: I love you.
And you said that really was very fitting for a woman who was really
all love,
a life of love, and she was all about love, and her final message to the world was a message of love. And that, you said, was what inspired you, and that's what overtook you and your life and really changed the course of what you were going to be doing and what you were going to dedicate your life to.
I truly cannot say. It took me months to be able to even think about that message of love and what her final moments were like. But I have come to understand over time that love is the most important thing in the world, and that what I can do to honor Nancy is to live in that love that she was. She was the most loving person.
And at some point after the trial, the murderer was convicted of 3 counts of murder for Nancy, for Richard, and for the unborn child. And at the time, he was sentenced to a mandatory life sentence, even though he was 16, without getting into the details of the law as it stood at the time. Tried as an adult, mandatory life sentence for the killing of Nancy, mandatory life sentence for the killing of Richard. He was also sentenced for the intentional killing of the unborn child, for another life sentence without parole, all without parole, that one being a discretionary life sentence. That just becomes important. We'll talk about that a little bit later, because some Supreme Court cases had an effect on that. Now, you were interested in making a victim impact statement after the trial, and you wanted to be heard at sentencing. And what was it that you were told at the time?
Yeah, so we, went through 18 months of trial and publicity, and the killer getting all this attention, and the agony and the unknown factors in the trial, and all of the focus. It was very, very traumatizing. But once he was found guilty, he was quickly found guilty. And the sentencing was set for 2 weeks later. We had been working by that point, almost 18 months, almost 2 years since the murder. And I had written my impact statement. My mother had written hers. Everybody was ready to make their victim impact statement. We wanted to say what had been taken that day, what Nancy's life meant to us. And so we got a phone call. Actually, I got a phone call the morning of the sentencing saying, the court's really busy. I'm sorry, but the life sentences are mandatory. We're just not going to take time to do victim impact statements. You can submit them in writing, but don't come to court today because we're not going to be doing victim impact statements.
And so you never made a victim impact statement after the sentencing, or at the sentencing. And at the time, the status of victims' rights in the state of Illinois didn't allow for victim impact statements necessarily to be part of the process, to the extent that there was any enforceability if they didn't happen.
Right. There was a right, but it was there was a weak constitutional amendment that had just been passed that year in Illinois that gave victims certain basic rights, and but it also said, but these are strictly symbolic. There's no enforcement. It actually said in the constitutional language, it was part of the political compromise to get it passed, that there were rights, but they were not enforceable in terms of any action that could be taken. So in other words, any violations were just fine, I guess.
And so for all intents and purposes, at the time, as the law stood in Illinois, at the end of sentencing, that was it as far as the victim's family.
There was no victims' rights for anything in post-conviction processes. That's correct.
So no post-conviction, no post-sentencing notification that had to happen according to Illinois law at the time. Right. Now, at that time, you decided to pursue victims' rights as your passion, consistent with what your message of love was that was sent to you by Nancy. And you got involved in a lot of different victims' rights efforts. We'd be here till later on tonight if we got through every single one of them. But just to summarize just a few of them, you started the statewide victims' rights organization, IllinoisVictims.org, I believe it was. You became the national chair for a murder victims family organization. And you began to speak at conferences all across the country and pursuing this passion, this life-changing passion that you have now adopted as your own. And one of the places that you spoke was in my neck of the woods in Boston. You went to Boston College, and you were on a panel at Boston College, you were telling me, where there was a very impressive person, and you were on the same panel, and it was talking about healing the wounds of murder, which was the subject matter. But there was a panelist that you found to be particularly impressive. Tell us about who that was.
Yeah, so that's Bishop-Jenkins, and he is now my husband. He was so impressive. He's now my husband. He had been the author of this book, What to Do When the Police Leave, A Guide to the First Days of a Traumatic Loss. His son had been murdered in Richmond, Virginia in 1997. And he and I were both invited to speak. I was actually the chair of this Healing the Wounds of Murder conference at Boston College in 2001. And we were on this panel together, and we spoke afterwards and became fast friends and met up, and the rest is history. So now we're both married murder victims' family members who work together to help other crime victims. And one time there was a Valentine's Day competition in a Chicago newspaper about how you met your Valentine, and I said, "Oh, we are so going to win this," and we did. We won the contest.
It's almost not even fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys have been referred to as the power couple in the victims' rights movement, and I think that's a pretty well-earned name. And Bill, and thank you, by the way, you've given me a copy of that book, and it really is a very compelling book, and it has some very good common sense advice in there too, that could only be written by somebody like Bill or yourself, who's actually experienced the sadness and the tragedy that you have experienced. Bill is also an expert on the neurobiology of trauma. I know that, and he is a real impressive guy, probably the subject matter of another one of these interviews, but ladies before gentlemen, as they say. So now, among other things and causes that you became involved in, you became involved in the Brady campaign to prevent handgun violence. Can you tell us a little bit about how you became involved with them and what you did when the Virginia Tech shooting happened?
I was so moved by the fact that the killer was motivated by wanting to see what it would feel like to shoot someone. I got involved with the Brady campaign as a volunteer. And then when I retired from my teaching career in 2005, after I was married to Bill, I accepted a position as their national program director for victims and survivors, which was a great honor. And I still worked out of Chicago, but I went to DC a lot. And that was when Virginia Tech happened. And it was just an amazing experience, but I got to, meet and interact with every one of those family members and to organize their meetings with then Governor Tim Kaine. Ultimately, we worked all together and we took those victims' families to Capitol Hill in the US Congress and walked the halls of Congress and got a bill called the NICS Improvement Act, National Instant Check System. That was the thing that failed when the killer Cho was able to get a gun and use it in Virginia Tech. He should not have been able to pass the background check, but because the Instant Check system had flaws in it, he was able to get a gun. And that is why those victims' families worked on that. And it was really an amazing experience getting to mobilize a group of victims and pass a bill on Capitol Hill.
And you and Bill began speaking together as a team all around the country, and you began to speak at the NOVA conferences, National Office of Victim Assistance conferences, every year. And then one particular conference in 2009, you told me about, and it was after Marsys Law had been passed in California in 2008, which, as we know, is the first state that Marsys Law was passed in. And there was a video presentation at the 2009 NOVA conference that grabbed your interest.
Yeah, so Bill and I were at the plenary meeting at the NOVA conference, National Organization of Victim Assistance, amazing thing for victim professionals. And we were watching this short 5-minute video featuring Dr. Henry Nicholas talking about the passage of a constitutional amendment for enforceable victims' rights in California. And I had been on a committee for the last year in Illinois. We called ourselves the Illinois Coalition for Enforceable Victims' Rights, trying to fix the weakness in our Constitution in Illinois. And Dr. Nicholas said in the video to the NOVA audience at the end of this, if we're thinking about going to other states, and if other states are interested, please let us know. Well, I literally ran across the room at the plenary session and found my friend Steve Twist, who's a leading organizer with NOVA and a major victims' rights advocate, and I knew that he would know what was going on. And I said, Steve, you know what we're doing in Illinois. I just heard that they, Marsys Law might want to expand into other states. And I was literally like breathless with excitement. And I said, do they know what we're doing in Illinois? And he said, I will tell them. And he made the introduction. And then we got to meet, myself and some of the other leaders in Illinois got to meet Dr. Nicholas. And ultimately, a year later, we were a Marsys Law state, the first state outside of Illinois, outside of California.
And so you were really one of the first people that began to be part of the Marsys Law movement outside of California.
Right.
And it wasn't just you in Illinois. You brought to bear quite an impressive coalition of people, elected officials and others, to ultimately pass Marsys Law in Illinois in 2014. Can you just tell us a little bit about the spectrum of people that you brought together to get Marsys Law passed?
That was an amazing experience building. Illinois is a very diverse state. You know, we've got Chicago and then this huge rural downstate. We had the chiefs of police. We had, you know, public safety and advocacy groups. We had, you know, unions. We had, you know, prosecutors. We had elected officials of all parties, both parties. We had upstate and downstate. I even mobilized, I was new from my work with the Brady campaign. I knew Reverend Jesse Jackson, who's based out of Chicago. He is a friend. We've done many events together. He got involved and supported Marsys Law strongly. And so we had from police chiefs to all the victim advocates, the Attorney General's office, law enforcement, everybody on board. It was an amazing coalition of upstate, downstate, all political parties, people from every walk of life. We had dozens and dozens churches, you know, church groups, everybody endorsing it. Building that coalition over the first 2 years of the campaign was an amazing experience.
And it's proof positive, despite the fact that ultimately Marsys Law does appear on the ballot. It's proof positive that victims' rights really does transcend politics and crosses the aisle naturally and organically through the work of the diverse groups like you put together. And Jesse Jackson is clearly, like you, a force of nature. You even share the same initials of JJ.
Yes.
And Jesse Jackson, I remember he talked about, when he was referring to Dr. Martin Luther King's quote of the arc of the moral universe, how the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends toward justice. But Jesse Jackson added to that, and he says, but you have to pull it to bend it. It doesn't bend automatically. And he has made his life a mission for doing that and pulling that arc of justice. And for you two to get together and ultimately bring together the groups that you did and pass Marsys Law was incredible. And on the night of passage, you told me that Dr. Nicholas joined all of you at a celebratory gathering. And there was something that you noted about Dr. Nicholas that you shared with me, and I'd love you to share it with the viewers.
You know, the night we were watching the results in November of 2014, and we were watching this overwhelmingly successful, most successful constitutional amendment passage in Illinois history. We're watching this overwhelming outpouring, and we had elected officials, and we had advocates, and we had media there, and we had, you know, a room filled with busy luminary people. Reverend Jackson was there, and so on. But what I noticed about Dr. Nicholas is he was always sitting over in the corner on a couch with one of the victims' families. He spent his evening that evening with all the victims' families and with me and with all of the others. And he went around to each person that was a victim, and he literally, it so moved me. And then years later, when we were celebrating the victory in Ohio, I went to that celebration and I found him doing the same thing again at this big evening watch party gathering, that he was talking to the victims' families that were there. That's who he spends his time with. That's his devotion. And I just love that about this movement. I love that about Marsys Law.
Yeah, it really speaks to his passion and speaks to his heart. And it really is, it really is
who he is. It is who he is.
Yeah, and it spreads throughout the organization, as you know, as you're still involved. And 30 years plus after your sister's murder, it's important that you have victims' rights because you're still exercising your rights as a murder victim's family member.
Yeah.
And you've referred to it as a life sentence of a different kind, but you're happy to stay involved. And it's because of a Supreme Court case that there's resentencing hearings now for your sister's murderer,
Yeah.
and you're going to become involved in those. And there's going to be another Supreme Court case that will probably be heard in the fall with respect to the murder of the unborn child, because that was a discretionary life sentence.
Right.
So that may, in fact, need to be readdressed. And you're going to be involved in all of those.
And the thing that makes the fact that now I have an enforceable right in our case, and B, I have post-conviction rights thanks to the passage of Marsys Law. Who would have thought that 30 years later I'd still be going to court on this case? It's hard on victims, and I think it's really important in many cases for people to understand that victims don't always get a one and done when it comes to the offender and sentencing. It is quite often for complicated and huge murder cases, it is quite often something that literally stays with you the rest of your life. And I will have to be re-engaging with this offender in the criminal justice system literally for the rest of my life. So who got the life sentence here?
Yeah, and with respect to even more current events, the coronavirus pandemic, you exercised your rights again and reminded a judge in Illinois about Marsys Law and the right to notification that victims have when there was a movement to release certain prisoners due to the coronavirus pandemic. And you took it upon yourself and filed a motion to intervene to remind the judge of the importance of notifying victims and that can't be skipped over.
Right. So, I mean, I was really worried when I heard that there was this class action federal civil rights lawsuit representing 7 classes of offenders in Illinois Department of Corrections, many of which were just, they were over 50, or they, had some medical diagnosis, literally covered like more than half of the inmates in Illinois potentially were asking to have an emergency release because of the coronavirus. And it's not that I opposed that, it's nothing to do with that, but I was just worried about the timing, not allowing the notifications to all those victims' families that are in law that we all work so hard to pass. We didn't want those to be skipped over or ignored. So I found a wonderful attorney advisor friend who helped me file a pro se motion. And then later I got some pro bono representation, but we got a motion to intervene filed on a Friday afternoon when they had just filed their case on a Thursday. And I got that motion to intervene just to remind them that they have victims' rights procedures that they have to go through if they're going to contemplate releasing offenders. On Monday, the judge heard the case, emergency ruled that there was not going to be any emergency releases. And it was a great relief that they were going to take the time that they needed. They are still working through a lot of inmate releases in Illinois, and as everywhere, but they're doing them in a timely way that allows victims' rights to be observed. And I have been verifying that, and that's really a great thing to be doing because of Marsys Law.
Yeah, well, you really have turned the life sentence of a different kind, as you referred to it, into a life passion, which is really so amazing, and the strength is so just awe-inspiring. And just to go back to Martin Luther King one last time, there was a quote of Dr. Martin Luther King where he said, "I have decided to stick with love, because hate is too great a burden to bear." And, when you experience what you experienced 30 years ago, all of the emotions that must have been going through you and the rest of your family's mind, and I'm sure hate was part of it. But because of your sister's message, you stuck with love.
I knew that after Nancy and Richard's death, that to let hate become my response to that, when she had so clearly taken those last moments of her life and literally used the last ounce of life in her body to say love, to give this message of love to us, to the world. I knew that to honor her was to live in love and to help other victims and to share who she was and to live how she inspired me to live. And that is quite literally, Peter, why I do what I do.
Well, thank you. It's a perfect way to end. And your fight goes on, and our fight goes on. And I really appreciate all the work that you do on behalf of victims everywhere and on behalf of Marsys Law. If you want to learn more about Marsys Law, as you know, go to marsyslaw.us, and we'll see everyone 2 weeks from now with another episode of Why We Do What We Do. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing your support. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.